As some of you know, which is the polite way of saying, I assume you did your readings, I wrote that column, which was an attempt to frame the triumph of Christianity in a proper historical context, which is not an easy thing to do. And what I'm going to try and do here today, which is to talk about the cultural impact of Christianity, encounters the same problem, and it encounters it even, I think, with an audience like this, that people are in the grip of a materialist interpretation of history, even when they are, as one may safely assume with this audience, not generally speaking in the grip of materialist ideas. But these things can sneak up on you. And the related difficulty, which arose in the column and will arise again in the course of the next hour, is getting people to see how strange some of the things that have happened in the past really are. We take them for granted, and we tend to regard things that happen as logical because they happen. This is what materialism does to you. And this blinds us to the astonishing course that history often takes. And when it comes, for instance, to the triumph of Christianity, even people who are very against the triumph of Christianity as a historical phenomenon will talk about it as though it was a logical thing to happen. Well, there was Rome, and they had these more primitive gods, and then along came some Eastern mystery religions, and it could have been Mithraism or Zoroastrianism, but it was Christianity, and then all these terrible things happened. But that's how Romes go. Oh yeah, okay, sure, fine. Bunch of guys from nowhere convinced the most cosmopolitan empire the world has ever seen that a dead Jewish carpenter is God, and everybody says, yeah, okay, fine. Certainly, artisans put to death by the authorities are frequently taken for the deity. Well, of course they're not. Even in triumphs of religion, you don't get stories like this one. And I'm not trying to be offensive here. I think I'm just following in Paul's footsteps when I use this kind of language. 1 Corinthians 1:23, that it's a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. The idea that a Jewish carpenter was God is bad enough when he's then set upon by his enemies, and instead of smiting them all, he's put to death. You're thinking, this is so ungodlike. Thor would not put up with this. Zeus would not put up with this. And the reason I think that people tend to swallow this kind of thing without straining at it is this idea that all of history is determined essentially by the laws of physics. Ever since the Renaissance, we've thought that mathematics is the language in which truth is written, we being them more than you, I think. But the prevailing assumption in the culture, we want to mathematize things. Even I work sometimes as an economist, and I'm a very aggressively non-mathematical economist, and I'm up against a profession that honestly will tell you GDP growth 2 years out is going to be 2.3%. So where'd you get the 0.3? Well, we ran a bunch of things through a computer. Okay. You collected some numbers which were imprecise, you assumed relationships you can't measure, and then you ran a calculation, and because you know that the computer doesn't make arithmetical mistakes, you're happy with your result. Well, yeah, because we've got to do all of this. Then you get social science processing human units, because again, what we fundamentally need to do is find some way to put you onto what was once a punch card, to assign numerical values to all the little aspects of your personality and social connections, and then we will understand you and know what to do with you. And so people take all of human existence as a physics problem, including history. If only we could know the position, and velocity, and mass of every particle at the Big Bang, we would know exactly what was going to happen throughout all of history. And although we don't, and probably never will, nevertheless, we can rest assured that everything that happened was the inexorable working out of the physical laws. And if Christianity triumphed, therefore it was bound to triumph, because the leptons and hadrons and all said that this was going to happen. And so this is why even in a world where the UN can put out maps of the Middle East with no Israel, they accept that Christianity happened and therefore was pretty much bound to happen. And when I actually still do some teaching, the University of Ottawa kindly opened its doors to me. I went and gave a talk at the Free Thinking Film Society, and the then chairman of the department turned out to have grown up in communist Poland and was somewhat sympathetic to the libertarian point of view, and thus they've allowed me to teach from time to time. And when I go in, I try to explain to my students, first of all, I try to tell them that I have opinions, not biases, which is because I'm willing to be argued with. But then I try to get them to shake them out of this vision that history is logical and inexorable. There are patterns to it, but you've got to shake this off. And so I always come up with the example of Harold Godwinson. Well, first, the Second World War. How unlikely was the Allied victory in World War II? I have often thought that if World War II had never happened and somebody had written it, some J.R.R. Tolkien had come up with this epic tale and given it to a publisher, the publisher would have said, we've got to do some editing here before we could give anybody this thing. Because your villain is too evil to begin with. This is just, people aren't going to buy this, too over the top. Secondly, the odds are so long. I mean, you can't seriously expect us to believe the Allies will win the Battle of Britain, that some Poles will smuggle out an Enigma machine and the Allies will not succumb to the U-boat menace, that somehow or other the Soviets will not crumble given all the incompetence and barbarism of Stalin and the overwhelming superiority of the Germans. You can't have the American victory at Midway. This is too much. Tone it down. But in fact, World War II really did happen and the Allies really did win. And it's easy to sit here now and say, but of course the Allies won. The Allies were bound to win World War II, but I don't think they were. I think we got very lucky. And the other one, as I say, I bring up Harold Godwinson, and I don't know if people really have a thing about Harold Godwinson, Harold the Nearly Great, as I think of him. Sorry? Okay. I don't mean to patronize you. I have weird enthusiasms, but this is one of them. Right before William the Conqueror takes over England, there's a crisis of succession because Edward the Confessor dies childless. And one of the guys who tries to take the throne is a Saxon noble named Harold Godwinson. And he actually gets himself declared king by the council. But he has problems. One of them is that he's under attack from the king of Norway and his own brother. And he sits down with his brother and says, what would I have to give you not to attack? Because I'm fed up with this. And his brother said, I want a third of the kingdom. But I also want to know what you're going to give my ally, the king of Norway. And Harold gives what could have become one of history's great replies. He said, 6 feet of ground. Or maybe a little more. I understand that he's tall. This answer didn't go down well over there in Oslo. So Harold's brother and the king of Norway, also called Harold, do attack. Harold force marches his army north, and at Stamford Bridge, he attacks his enemies, he kills them. His brother and the king of Norway get their 6 feet of earth or slightly more. Then William the Conqueror invades. Harold force marches his army south, draws up in battle order at Hastings, and catches an arrow in the eye, and becomes one of history's great chumps, and the Normans take over, and England becomes feudal and part of Europe, not Scandinavia. And of course, this was all bound to happen because we all know that feudalism succeeds the Dark Ages. And I sometimes imagine that the guy lining up the shot isn't aiming for Harold. He's aiming for somebody else. Someone jostles his elbow. The arrow goes wild. Says, you idiot, I had that big guy lined up. At any event, we could easily be talking about how Harold the Great saved Anglo-Saxon liberty from the joint threats from Norway and from the continent of Europe with its Roman law and so on, instead of there being a Stamford Street in London that nobody knows what it is. And so I try to use this to shake my students up a little. Sometimes I teach a course, one of the American surveys, that goes from the end of the Civil War to 1945. And when we get to 1945, I say to them, now, you've got to look out because you know what happens next. And I don't know that we ought to say civil rights was not yet on the agenda, as though the machine of history was going to grind it out. There are certainly reasons why the United States would become concerned about civil rights, apart from the obvious moral one that had not changed in 100 years or more. Getting into the Cold War with the Soviets, competing for the allegiance of the Third World, urbanization, migration, all kinds of things. Nevertheless, that not yet, as though all of history was just preparing for us. I don't think anybody in 1945 could have seen the 1960s coming. I certainly don't think anybody did see the 1960s coming. So again, I can give you some reasons why the 1960s came along. I can make it all sound pretty convincing, but look out. There are surprises. I also point out the Louisiana Purchase, when Jefferson buys the middle part of North America in 1802, would have astonished Thomas Jefferson circa 1792. So if he would have been surprised, we're allowed to be. Having made that point, I tell the students that people matter, and that means they're not off the hook. And of course, I point out that sometimes, some people are dealt a pretty tough hand. If you're a child who's murdered in the Holocaust, it's hard to know what impact you could have had on history, or Polish officers killed in the Katyn Forest. Nevertheless, what if Winston Churchill had been run down by a motor car in America, as he nearly was? What if the Poles who'd smuggled out the Enigma machine hadn't had the guts or had gotten caught? What if there had been no Franklin Roosevelt? I think you could point to a lot of places where the course of history is dramatically affected by individuals. What if George Washington had died of dysentery at Valley Forge? Would there be a United States? Now, obviously, when I'm talking to a room full of Christians and I'm saying individuals affect history, if I bring up Jesus of Nazareth, you're going to think I probably have a point. However, you might think my point is unusual in that Jesus is not like other people, since nobody else was simultaneously man and God. It's a bit of a special case. However, even if you take a non-Christian point of view and look at the triumph of Christianity and say, well, how different would world history be if this guy had died in infancy, as so many people did in the ancient world? How differently would the world turn out? People love what-if history. My wife and I went to the radio show where we had a what-if author on, and it lit up the phones. Everybody loved it. And one of the great ones had the Soviets in the worst part of World War II, and the Germans are just attacked. The Politburo panics and shoots Stalin and makes Molotov general secretary. And then he works it out so that the Soviet Union falls apart on the same day, that it made no difference at all. And of course, we can't run the experiment in a lab. It's very frustrating. We can't have two Soviet Unions. But I think this is probably not true. I think people matter, and I think ideas matter, and that the course of history is often very highly contingent. And if I've at least made some kind of case for you in that basis, then we can move on to the question not of what if Jesus had died as an infant, which obviously from the point of view of the audience wasn't going to happen, but the question of Christianity's cultural impact identified not as something that was necessary and logical, but as something very weird. That we live in a weird world. That we live in a world that didn't have to arise out of what was in place in the Roman world, the Greco-Roman world, in the year 0. That it would not have been logical for somebody living in Rome in the year 100 to predict either that Christianity would become the official religion of Rome and then the dominant faith of the West, or that the culture of Rome would be transformed in anything like the way that it was. I'm intrigued by Rome because so much of it's so familiar and yet so much of it is so unfamiliar. Sort of different from Egypt. I think ancient Egypt is interesting because it's so... I can't get a handle on it. There sits the Sphinx staring at me and it wants something and I don't know what. I just can't get a word out of it. With Rome, a lot of what's going on is very familiar, and yet there are things about Rome that they could be on the dark side of the moon in terms of their accessibility. And I think that this can be explained because of the impact of Christianity. And I want to suggest that a whole lot of things changed because of that in a cultural sense that were positive, that were completed, substantially completed by the Middle Ages, and that are inseparable from the weirdness of Christianity. We're back to the dead Jewish carpenter because Christianity is odd. Christianity gives people ideas they wouldn't otherwise have. And then people act on these ideas. When I teach my students history, another thing that I tell them, there are really two competing understandings of historical forces. That people are moved by ideas, or that people are moved by their material interests. And I suggest to them that the material interest explanation doesn't wash, because even if people are looking out for what's best for them, the only way they can do that is based on what they think is best for them. And then the example I always bring up is there an afterlife and a day of judgment? Because your sense of where your best interest lies is profoundly affected by whether you think that or not. If you think you can do anything at all, and as long as you get into your grave and slam the coffin lid down before anybody gets to you, you're home free, you're going to behave very differently than if you suspect that this is just the beginning of your problems. What people think about the world, how they think it works cosmologically, affects intimately what they do on a day-to-day basis. And one of the odd things I said there and didn't dwell on it, but now I shall, is that things were good and completed by the Middle Ages. People don't generally like the Middle Ages. Maybe if there are Catholics in the room, maybe some of you like the Middle Ages. On the whole, the Middle Ages get a very bad press, and we're going to have to deal with that. Partly because we have, again, we walk around with this kind of template that has been given us by people since the Renaissance, that antiquity was a period of free and rational inquiry and light And then we sank into the darkness and obscurantism and monks debating how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. And then with the Renaissance, the rebirth. This is the rebirth of the rational, sane, sensible, ancient world in modern times. And history is divided into three parts: ancient, good; medieval, boo; modern, yay. And I want to suggest that, in fact, things are very different, that the ancient world stands apart from the Middle Ages and the modern world, and that if I had to take my choice, I'd go with the Middle Ages, not the modern world, but that they are the two that belong together, and the one that is not like the others is the ancient world. And this is a very hard thing to argue again. I don't mind hard tasks, and I hope I don't baffle you too much with my preoccupations, but words like enlightenment. Oh yeah, then was the Enlightenment. So there was dark, and then there was light. Or the Renaissance. All these kind of things, even Reformation. Again, I don't want to cause a religious war in the room, but there was something really bad and it had to be reformed. And so all this great stuff happens in the 15th century, and we can say goodbye to those terrible Middle Ages. And thus it is, and I collected a bunch of examples I'm going to inflict on you. When people don't like something, they call it medieval. Osama bin Laden, people called him medieval. Then when he was killed, people called that medieval, right? Medieval, a word being a word here meaning boo hiss, down with that. Judges have called conditions in Canadian jails holding people awaiting trial like the Middle Ages. In what particular way? Well, let's not get into that. A story about honor killings. One was in the West Bank, and a letter writer to the Citizen said it could easily have happened in India, Pakistan, Yemen, or other countries where pockets of people still live under some twisted medieval code of honor that requires girls to be killed for even minor infractions. Well, fine, but that didn't happen in the Middle Ages. I mean, not that people didn't get murdered, often for stupid reasons. I don't think there are a lot of good reasons for murder. Starting the UN war crimes trial of Slobodan Milosevic, the chief prosecutor, Carla Del Ponte, accused him of medieval savagery. Robin Cook, the British Foreign Secretary, said that the practice of Serbs putting Albanians in concentration camps, he said that practice belongs to the Middle Ages. It does not belong to modern Europe. Oh, really? I thought concentration camps were invented by the Bolsheviks and the Nazis. These are mere facts, however. And it just goes on and on. Oriana Fallaci, after she interviewed the Ayatollah Khomeini, she peeled off her chadar and called it a stupid medieval rag. Show me a medieval burqa. I mean, okay, this is not like subtle points of historical debate here. This is simply people babbling. I don't want to run these over and over and over. Well, maybe I do. Another guy in the Ottawa Citizen accused bin Laden of marrying his prescriptions from medieval theology to the problems of 21st century geopolitics. Which medieval theologian wanted to fly planes into buildings? Lisiane Gagnon in La Presse says, que faire devant ces fous de la sortie du Moyen-Âge, qui n'aspirent qu'à simuler en tuant le plus d'innocents possible? You know, these are people who don't agree about anything else in the world. Jeffrey Simpson calls Afghanistan medieval in many ways, including political culture. Ezra Levant said the Taliban is a medieval serfdom that uses Islam as an excuse. An excuse for what? For being a medieval serfdom? They thought we'll become a medieval serfdom. Quick, we've got to find a reason, grab that Quran and look through it for something. It amazes me, this sort of stuff. George Jonas says that planes that go to the Middle East whisk travelers back to the Middle Ages. My colleague Dan Gardner in the Ottawa Citizen, this is the last example I'll give you, medieval is a word one cannot avoid in any discussion of Saudi Arabia. I can avoid any discussion of medieval. Where's the parliament? Medieval countries have parliaments. Where's the chivalry? Where's the respect for women? Where's any of this? Anyway, this goes on and on, but I'll stop now. Oh, except for somebody else who said that the Harris government was taking us back to medieval times and was taking from the poor to give to the rich, which is a guy who did the legend of Harris Hood. But Robin Hood took from the rich to give to the poor. So this one, this is not rocket surgery. And then, when Angela Merkel in Germany said that she was glad bin Laden had been killed, a member of her own party said, I wouldn't have used those words. That's a vengeful way of thinking that one shouldn't have. That's medieval. Give me a break. Now, in fact, the Middle Ages, like one of the things people say at the Middle Ages, that if it wasn't dark, it was from the light of all the burning witches. But in fact, in the Middle Ages, there was very little witch burning. This is really a Renaissance Reformation thing. It is extraordinary to look at the actual statistics on this. The death penalty for witchcraft appears during the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and goes on well into the 17th century before they finally put a stop to it. Or they thought the earth was flat. Har, 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 what a bunch of rubes. Well, really, if you look up John Sacrobosco, or Goodwood, had a best-selling medieval geography primer. There's nothing all that original there, but it was the Coles Notes, or the Earth Not Flat for Dummies book of the time. John Holywood, sorry. He gives 3 typical proofs that the world is round, including if a ship sails over the horizon, the hull disappears before the mast. You don't always see the same stars at the same latitudes. I mean, this is stuff. Now have your modern student say, show me the world is round without a picture from space.
Who was that second-in-command librarian in Alexandria who calculated the circumference of the Earth?
I do not know, but it was done. But that's the ancient world, right? But then in the Middle Ages, they all got stupid, right? Well, they didn't. They knew the Earth wasn't flat. Totally ridiculous. And other things about the Middle Ages. You know, people were not all dead before they were alive in the Middle Ages. In fact, there's some evidence that they were taller in the Middle Ages than they were by the 17th century. It was in many ways cleaner than at least the 19th century cities, produced a kind of hell on earth that no one had ever seen before. And there were also, in the more refined sphere, which I want to get to, a whole bunch of things. The first one, talking to doctors, they invented the hospital. There must have been something going on in the Middle Ages if they would invent the hospital. This is not the stupidest thing or the meanest thing anybody ever did. Also, my grandfather was a medieval historian and apparently prone, when irritated by the world, to mutter, "It was better under Clovis." And in one of his books, he said that today we're perhaps more acutely aware of the continuity of history. We value the Middle Ages as providing not so much the foundation as the pattern of our civilization. We appreciate more the underlying identity of our 20th century way of life with that of our medieval predecessors. The Middle Ages were a period when our own constitutional ideals and traditions, which still continue and without which our civilization cannot live, were simply and vigorously expressed. And I think this is a very important part of the story, which I will give a little more attention to in a moment. But you look at the opening of our Parliament. British Parliament has been electing its own Speaker. The House of Commons has since 1376. 1297, I make all my students memorize this. In 1297, typically hard up for money, Edward I met his Parliament and promised them no taxation without representation. In 1297. That's where that comes from. And I don't think we're going to get it back if we give it away. Before we laugh at the Middle Ages, let's remember that they gave us the pattern of limited self-government. They gave us a lot of other things too, and most of them, it seems to me, have to do with a considerable advance in decency. And one of these, when you think about Rome, you think about, legions and catapults and a few other galleys maybe, things like that, and you think about slavery. Rome is one of the 5 civilizations in the world that really seems to have built its economy substantially on slavery. And obviously, when Rome falls, slavery in some form or another continues. Given the general disruption, it doesn't continue on as large a scale, but there is still slavery. But slavery in the Middle Ages tends to disappear, especially in the North and the West. And then in the glorious Renaissance and Reformation, it comes back in a singularly dreadful, racially based form. Another thing the modern world should perhaps not be quite as proud of. And it is an interesting thing. I taught a course on slavery in the United States, and one of the things I wanted to do a little comparison. We did one comparison with slavery in Rome, and one was slavery in the modern world, particularly sexually driven slavery. And reading about slavery in Rome, one of the things that stood out, we had a very good book by Keith Bradley about it, but nobody really in Rome seemed to think that there was something in principle wrong with slavery. It took abolitionism a while to get its work done in Britain and the United States, but Rome had no abolitionist movement. And that is one of the oddest things. Was slavery in Rome more or less brutal than in the Americas? Really, I don't think either of them can have defenders. It just seems to have been almost equally bad in both places. you can nitpick. It was easier probably to get freed in Rome, and a freed slave in Rome had better social prospects than a freed slave in the United States did. But the Romans just never seem to have thought to themselves on any kind of significant scale, this is a bad thing. We should not treat our fellow humans this way. Whereas even a rogue and a hypocrite like Thomas Jefferson, one of my least favorite figures in American history, trembled for his country when he reflected that God was just and he thought about slavery. That didn't mean he freed his slaves, of course, and more. But the fact of the matter is that the Romans just seem to have looked right past it. And I think that one of the reasons why is that once you become Christian and you think about the world from the point of view of God being a baby in a manger, helpless, from a despised region, at the bottom almost of the social ladder, you cannot feel the same way about the helpless again. And in fact, Bradley, he doesn't really go very far in this direction. Actually, he goes the other way. He says the coming of Christianity didn't make much difference. But he says one thing is that it became illegal to brand a slave on the face because of something to do with man being made in the image of God. And I say, give it a little time, okay? People are logical, but slowly, as Jay Budjachevsky says. It took a while for this thing to work itself through, but it did work itself through. That it was not appropriate to hold the image of God as a thing rather than as a human being. It didn't mean people didn't despise their neighbors and kill them and make war and do all the sorts of lovely things people do. But there was something about the medieval attitude toward humanity that was different from the Roman attitude toward humanity. And to this day, again, it's not as though we exactly in the modern world have a stellar record on how we treat our fellows, but at least in the Christian world, there is this kind of unease at the mistreatment and the reification, that the turning of a person into a thing makes us unhappy in a way that it seems not to in other parts of the world. And I think that you can trace this back to this rather curious idea. I mean, I don't know how to quote Woody Allen here. I certainly do not do it with an enthusiastic endorsement of the man or his career or behavior. But in one of his movies, he does that thing about, oh, come on, in the image of man made in the image of God, you think he wears glasses? And I think it's Diane Keaton says, well, certainly not ones like yours. But of course, that is not what the phrase means, and we all know this. So there, it seems to me, right away, you see a difference that is very, very significant. Now, another thing about the Middle Ages, people don't quite understand this. And again, I do not mean to say that there was a lively feminist movement with the Pankhursts, but the status of women in the Middle Ages is higher than it was by a considerable margin in the ancient world. Women can rule. Women are certainly in theory entitled to respect. You can have nuns as well as you can have monks. Because the Mother of God is revered. And again, people may think one thing and do another. They always have, and I suspect they always will. But the attitude toward Mary gets into people's minds, and it starts to change how they... I mean, the courtly love and the knight and his lady and so on. Again, you could regard a lot of this as purple prose by hack writers that was not followed by those even who read it. But there's a difference. And, you know, in studying history, I've read a lot of books, some of them better than others. And I remember one was talking about the coming of the Europeans to the New World and about gender relations. This is the Iroquois. The Iroquois, the author assured us, treated their women with a respect the Europeans didn't know anything about. And then he said, now, of course, it was easy to make this mistake because women were not allowed to speak in public, but I assure you that they were secretly respected. You know, do not try this at home, folks. This is an attempt to deny the obvious, that women in Western society, by the end of the Middle Ages, and people from other cultures notice this, that women have a social freedom and an intellectual freedom that is not present in other places. And again, I do not think that it is possible to have the attitude that you have toward Mary without this happening. And I do not think that it is possible to suggest that this attitude that pervaded the society can be regarded as having no importance. And again, This too is tied into this respect for weakness that comes out of the nativity story, and the fact that Christ doesn't blast everybody or slay them with his giant stone hammer or something like that. There's a story, and I don't know, this is probably apocryphal, but it's such a good story that I'll tell it anyway, and you can reject it at your leisure, that some group of Frankish warriors who'd been having the Christians come and preach to them, and they were getting sympathetic to the story. When they get to the crucifixion, the chief cries out, "If I and my warriors had been there, we would have rescued him." And it takes a little bit of doing to say, no, you don't understand. It was absolutely necessary that he not be rescued. Yes, thank you, that's a good thought, but put up your sword. This, I think, as I said, slavery, women, also children. In the Roman world, infanticide is not even really remarkable. It's just one of those things. You very often have to get rid of a baby, and you very often do. I think people had some kind of written on the heart unease about it, but the practice was very widespread, and nobody said boo about it. Now, in the Middle Ages, of course, I'm not saying nobody ever killed a baby, but mass graves of infants, this routine disposal of infants, the right of the father of the family to expose a child. If you're known to have murdered a baby in the Middle Ages, you're going to be the subject of a rather pointed inquiry by the civil authorities and the religious ones. It's just not the same. Now, again, you could, in this sense, you might want to put the modern world and the ancient world together and have the Middle Ages be regarded as the exception, because clearly we are, at least before the baby is actually delivered, we seem to have redeveloped the pagan attitude. There's more where that came from. But in all of this, there's an emphasis on the dignity of the individual regardless of who or what they are. And another thing that I do to my students when I start my courses, I ask them who knows the story of Alfred and the Cakes. And I don't know, the Harold Godwinson fan club may have no members. Does anybody here know the story of Alfred and the Cakes? Okay, we got a hand. All right. This story comes out of the darkest of the Dark Ages. It's the real king, Alfred of Wessex, the only English monarch who's actually known as the Great. In 876, struggling against the Danes, who are burning everything and stealing whatever won't catch fire, he is ambushed around Christmas time. He's nearly killed. He flees in confusion into the marshes, and, as the story has it, in disguise, he comes to a cowherd's hut and he knocks on the door and says, "I'm a poor, hungry traveler. May I sit by your fire?" The woman looks at him skeptically, but says, "Okay, all right, come on in, warm yourself. I got to go out and glean, watch the cakes, the little loaves that are baking, and don't let them burn." So off she goes. And he's sitting there cleaning his weapons, thinking, where have my thanes gotten to? How do I contact the men of Mercia? How can I beat the Danes? Next thing he knows, the hut's full of smoke from the burning loaves, and the woman's in the doorway screaming at him, "You no good lazy bum, all he has to do is watch the bread. Is that so much now? What are we going to eat?" And Alfred apologizes to her. He doesn't stand up and say, "Madam, I am the king, shut your mouth," or swat her head off, or "Down on your knees." He apologizes to her. And then in various fanciful embroidery, because then Alfred goes off and he beats the Danes, retakes London, forces the Danish king to submit to Christianity, then devotes his life to such things as learning Latin so he can translate learned works into Anglo-Saxon because learning has fallen off. Becomes a warrior, a man of piety, and a scholar. And then supposedly he sends the woman some loaves, and when she opens them, there are gold coins inside, or, add your own happy ending here. But it's a model of kingship where the King of England will submit to a tongue lashing from a cowherd's wife. And I don't think you're going to find this story, even in France. I am sure you're not going to find this story in the Persian Empire. This is an Anglosphere story about kingship. And I must just put in, I think I can steal a minute here, Canute and the Tides, rather more famous one. King Canute told the tide to stop. What a loser. No. Nothing of the sort. What happened with King Canute, who was actually a Danish interloper, but a pretty good one as these things go, his counselors told him he was such a great king that he could stop the tides. And he said, "What a fascinating theory. So why don't you pick up my chair? We're going to go down to either the ocean or the Thames. Low tide, put the chair down." He sat in it, and as the water came up, he said, "I am the king. Stop." And of course, the water poured into his boots. He turned to his counselors and said, "Listen, you idiots, I'm the king. I get flattery for free. I don't have to pay for it. You all need to tell me the truth, okay? Tell me what I can't do. Tell me what I'm doing wrong. Don't sit there telling me I can command the tides." Again, these are stories that seems to me come out of a culture that has more humility and less arrogance. Again, don't try telling Xerxes he cannot stop the tides. Don't try telling Xerxes anything. Speaking of Xerxes, a couple of things that are so big and so obvious, people tend to overlook them about the cultural impact of Christianity. After Christ, no new polytheistic religions make an impact on the world. Mankind has been generating polytheistic religions since the first man sat under a tree and said, "What's this all about?" No more. But really, there are only two significant religions after this: Islam and Mormonism, both of which are not merely monotheistic, but both of which claim to be in the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's an interesting change. Also, no more god kings. Those monarchs who'd made a claim to divinity prior to Christ get to keep it. The Japanese emperor right up to World War II, possibly later. But no new ones. And again, you might say, well, duh, what king ever behaved like he was a god? Nevertheless, the fact is people have been getting away with this over and over again in all kinds of parts of the world, but once the gospel arrives, that's all done with. That's a bit odd. Again, you have to just shake off the fact that you know what happened and think to yourself, what's this about? I mean, and in Rome, of course, the fact that the emperor was a god had become a bit of a joke. Not least amongst those emperors. Emperor Vespasian apparently was a chronic wisecracker. Even on his deathbed, he was just tossing off the one-liners. And when he felt mortality seizing him for real, he said, "Dear me, I must be turning into a god." Nevertheless, obviously, people in Rome were getting a little bit, "You got to be kidding me," about this god king thing. However, in all kinds of parts of the world, ask the Incas. You could go almost anywhere and you're going to run into this. After Christianity appears, not even among those who don't accept it are we going to try this stunt again. That's different. And one of the reasons I think, if you've ever looked at the Roman myths, in fact, one Greek writer talking about the Greek myths was just appalled. He said, "What are these gods? You've given them every disagreeable and dishonest quality a person could have. This is terrible. Don't tell children this." But the Romans, I would venture to submit, crushing an entire civilization with an aside, had no theology. In the real and honest sense of that word, the Romans had no theology. They had some philosophical speculation and they had some myths, but they didn't connect to one another. In fact, when I read Roman authors, Plutarch appears quite clear that there is no immortal soul. Sallust, he's sure there is. Caesar apparently didn't believe in an afterlife. Julius, that is. The Romans, they didn't even have an orthodoxy on whether there was an afterlife or not. Wouldn't you care? I think people did have beliefs about it personally, but it's not connected up to anything. There's no reasoning structure behind it. And at some point, the obvious thing to do is just to say, "Oh, the heck with it. It's just a bunch of stories to frighten children." Our savage ancestors believed that the gods made it rain. They thought it was winter because Persephone was down in Hades, but we've all outgrown that. I mean, don't forget, the Romans were not a bunch of hicks. They were sophisticated, cosmopolitan, jaded, degenerate people. The thing about Caesar divorcing his wife because Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, apparently this was regarded by people who knew him as an astonishing piece of chutzpah. But evidently, Julius Caesar himself was so notoriously degenerate that it was preposterous that he would cast aspersions on anybody else. Of course, that may have just been his enemies talking. But when the Christians come along, instead of everybody just saying, "Oh, the heck with it, just party like it was the year -1, they come along with a theology. They come along with an explanation. With a famous scene with Paul in Athens, with the statue of the unknown God, and Paul says, "It's interesting that you have the unknown God. Let me try to use that as a hook to explain to you that you saw something through the glass darkly, and I can help you with this." Instead, it becomes impossible not to have a theology if you want to have a religion. And that's why no more god kings, because there's no rational theology that's going to make your monarch into a god. And no more polytheisms, because we're looking for a prime mover. We need an explanation, like with that Norse myth. Well, at the beginning, a cow licked the ice and unfroze the giant. And of course, anybody over the age of 7 is going to say, where did the ice come from? Your religion has got to explain the ice. We're just not going anywhere without that. And if that happens to you, if you get to the point where you are insisting on some kind of explanation of why there's something, not nothing, you're going to insist on some kind of rational explanation of a lot of other things too. The habit of asking why is going to become hard to shake off once it's gotten into you to that level. And that's one of the things about Rome that's odd, is a certain... often the instincts of the Romans are good, but they can't explain it. I mean, there's sort of stoicism. I think it's Victor Davis Hanson who's written very well on the military aspect of West versus non-West over the millennia. The legionnaires, you sent a bunch of legionnaires to guard a bridge. They went and they guarded it. They didn't go chasing the local women. They didn't go off and get drunk. They didn't just go home. They guarded the bridge. And they stayed there until it was either they were relieved or they died. But they couldn't really tell you why they did that. I mean, and the Romans, for instance, suicide is just like, okay, this has gotten a bit much, I'm out of here. Marcus Aurelius, when he talks about suicide, he says, the hut smokes, I move out. There's no need to make a fuss. There's no reward waiting for you on the other side. Now, rationally speaking, if there is no afterlife, surely hedonism is the right answer. This is the only fun you're going to have, grab it now. But the Romans didn't do that. They actually behaved as though they had an understanding that they didn't have about the way the world was. But once you get Christianity and you get an explanation of all of this that seems to a lot of intelligent people to make sense, you're not going to be able to pass off incoherent ideas to people anymore. And this is going to change the world. Now, perhaps this will sound like a bit of a, from sublime to ridiculous, but I want to talk a bit now about political institutions. Because the Romans, again, they're in the near-miss category in political institutions. Rome was a republic. Rome did have the rule of law. And again, Paul's story, they're about to do him in, he says, Civis Romanus sum, and all the machinery of a citizen having rights against the state kicks in. But the Romans didn't have functioning democratic institutions. To the extent that I understand it, which is not all that great anyway, the Roman political institutions just didn't hang together properly. The popular assembly couldn't initiate laws. Very serious problem. All it could do is react to them. They had vetoes of vetoes. There was a serious institutional incoherence in Rome. The Romans believed in natural law, and they believed that it came from the people. But they couldn't make it work. There really were not effective protections, although, again, it's a half and half there, because life in the Roman Empire sure beat life outside the Roman Empire. Even when Rome itself had turned into a carnival of Petronius, out in the provinces things were fairly normal, unless you were a slave, in which case they were sort of normal bad. But something happens in medieval Europe that's different. And again, you say, oh yeah, well, we have feudalism, you have city-states, you have liberties, blah, blah, blah. You have representative assemblies, we all know about that. Reaches its perfection in England, not so great elsewhere. But in most of the world, this never happens. Western Europe is weird. Post-advent of Christianity, Western Europe is different politically than any other part of the world. And other parts of the world are substantially like one another. Tribal or tyrannical, depending on the scale of social organization. So you look at Western Europe and you see that it's different, and you ask yourself, why is it different? And I think, again, you come back to man is made in the image of God. Every single individual matters somehow, and they need to matter to the political system. Now, I'm much more informed here about England than I am about other places, and of course English history is more compelling in this way. And this is one of these puzzles, why England is so special and so different. But as somebody did memorably point out, because you think of England as being the semi-Protestant place, what I'm talking about here, England is a Catholic nation. We're way before Henry Tudor and all of this. The idea in Europe is that government is contractual. That nobles and kings have rights that are tied to duties. And as early as the 12th century, commentators in England say, if the king does not follow the law, he's no king, because it is the law that makes him the king. Again, do not try this in Persia. Do not try this in Japan. But in England, you can write this and make your way at court with this book in your hand, which the king knows you wrote. This notion that people just should not be randomly and gratuitously messed with. The idea of liberties, oaths between ruler and subject, from king and noble, noble to squire, squire, down to free peasant. All of this is tied together. And of course, you also get in Europe what you don't get anywhere else, the separation of church and state. Now, you may attempt, but I think you will fail, to dismiss in this context the biblical parable, bring me the coin, whose face is on it. What Jesus says about rendering unto Caesar that which is Caesar's is that government, although it is a subordinate institution, has a dignity proper to it. It has a role to play, and in that role it ought to be allowed to carry out its functions. And this is extremely important because it gives government a job that in principle it can do. When government has the job of making men into angels, it will fail. When government has the job of preserving order and letting people go to court if their stuff gets stolen, including by the king, it has some chance at least of succeeding. But is it just coincidence that only where Christianity says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, people get this idea that the two should operate separately? Now, of course, in Europe, there's a lot of tension over all of this, not least because if the church excommunicates the king, then presumably he doesn't get to be king anymore. Normally, people take it, well, let's not be hasty about this attitude when this happens. Bad King John was, at one point, was excommunicated. In fact, John, at one point, was a hero to the English because of the fact that he defied the Pope. Because when he was excommunicated, everybody didn't just move away from him there on the bench. They kind of thought, let's see if the Pope has second thoughts. Let's work this out. Let's see who kills who. A lot of issues here we've got to work through before we decide exactly what we're going to do. Also, often the kings insisted upon a say in appointing clerics. So it's not as though you get Thomas Jefferson's imaginary wall between church and state. Nevertheless, you get a feeling that government should have a job it can do, and that the church should not attempt to be the government. That it has more important tasks, but they're separate tasks. And I think when you look at the development of parliamentary liberty, this is one of the things that happens. And in fact, at one point there was a confrontation between one of the English kings and the Pope, where the Pope orders the king to do something, and the king says, of course, I'm a good Catholic, nothing would make me happier. However, I'm a constitutional monarch, and what you've asked me to do is something where Parliament must have a say, so I actually can't do it. And then Parliament says, well, if we were to do what you just said, we feel that we would infringe upon the privileges of the monarch, and again, the English Constitution doesn't work that way, so, go jump in the Tiber. And that's it for the Pope. He's just checkmated by the division of powers that exists in the medieval English Constitution, and he's far away, and that's the end of that. Mention the hospital. So Parliament is another medieval invention that appears in medieval Europe and nowhere else. And I think our lives would be a great deal poorer without hospitals or parliaments. And the rituals and rules that evolved over the centuries to guarantee the Englishman's home is his castle, and be it ever so dilapidated and leaky, the king himself cannot come in without permission, which the American revolutionaries cite. They know they're citing English doctrine 500 years old. Why is an Englishman's home his castle? What gives the individual this value in the eyes of the law? And again, you could explain it cynically. Well, the English had a tendency to rise up with pitchforks if you tried to bother them, but which they did. But there's an understanding in everybody's minds, yes, this person here has a right that no Persian would have. And I think one of the examples, the Battle of Lepanto, one of these, nobody knows when or where it was, but when the Ottomans are attempting to take over the world, and Don Juan of Austria and various other unwashed vagabonds scrape together a European fleet, and they clash, and there's this slaughter on an unbelievable and thoroughly one-sided scale. But the Persian admirals have their treasure with them. Because if they leave it home, or the Ottomans, I should say, if they leave it home, just like Xerxes' generals, he's going to steal it while they're gone. Of course, the Europeans just put theirs in the bank. Very different societies. And as at Salamis, also at Lepanto, you get fishermen volunteering to man the oars of the western galleys. in what looks, for one thing, like a lost battle. And for another thing, who wants to be at the oar of a galley? Nobody volunteers for the Ottoman fleet. Nobody volunteers for the Persian fleet. There's a kind of sense of mutual obligation that ties a society together that's so profound it's easy to overlook. Now, again, I'll go from the sublime to the even more ridiculous. But another way in which medieval Europe is different from Rome is that it's economically dynamic. You talk about economic dynamism, maybe you think about the Industrial Revolution and James Watt and steam engines and power looms, and then, of course, your iPad. And yeah, what's the new operating system for the Mac has a lot of the stuff from the iPad. I mean, the iPad 2, you got an iPad 1, which I do, you paper bag. But the Middle Ages, in fact, compared to Rome, Rome is technologically stagnant. The Romans do a couple of good things with waterproof cement. And the Romans were very great engineers. You know, their roads worked. But first thing, apparently, that came out of the post-Roman period is hay. Now, you may think hay is a bunch of dry grass, but if you don't want to have to kill all your cattle every fall, you better get yourself some hay. Then they come up with the stirrup, the horse collar, the heavy-wheeled plow. Then they build wind and water mills all over the place. By the time the Renaissance comes along, an enormous amount of work in Europe is being done by animals or machines that is being done by hand elsewhere in the world. And again, you may think this is getting increasingly fanciful, but when Woody Allen's point about the glass is missing entirely the notion, what does it mean that man is made in the image of God? Well, in some ways, I think there is a trinity of existence, of knowledge, and of will, which matches up to the three persons of the Trinity, but also that man is, in a subordinate way, creative. The God is the creator. Men are creative in the Christian understanding of these things. And a Christian society tends to be a creative society, even in small ways. The chimney, for instance. Somebody invented the chimney. And again, you could easily, I would have thought of that if I'd been around, but, nobody did. Also, I mentioned hospitals, eyeglasses, a medieval invention. Not bad. Anybody? How many people here could take theirs off and still know who was talking to them? I wouldn't know who you were, that's for sure. And also, and maybe this would be regarded as the curse that the Middle Ages inflicted on us, but for better or worse, universities. The idea of an institution with a curriculum and a faculty and a student body is medieval. Hospitals, parliaments, universities, eyeglasses. That's not bad for a couple of centuries' work. Now, if that's not enough for you, polyphony, harmony in music. The Beatles may go off to India, but not me, thanks. I'm sorry to say it, but I do think that this breakthrough, the Mass being sung in parish with two voices, with counterpoint and so on, then they invent musical notation, which also the rest of the world didn't have. Quite an extraordinary thing. For my money, the cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals, as they were scorned in later generations, are an extraordinary achievement in making stone soar. Again, talking about Egypt, and pyramids are kind of cool, right? The pyramids are big. The Great Pyramid at Giza was the biggest building in the world for 4,000 years, but it was a pile of rocks. So the Pharaoh said, I want a big building. How do we do that? They said, we pile up rocks. You kind of slope them in. That way they don't do that. Except on the bent pyramid the first time. Okay, yeah, maybe it did. Medieval cathedrals are something entirely different. It's amazing that somebody thought you could do this with stone and then figured it out. The flying buttress is one of those absolutely stunning inspirations. And I do not know how much weight you want to attach to this, but I had the good fortune to go to Israel some years back. The Canada-Israel Committee sponsored a trip. And we went to Yad Vashem. And I'm at a loss to know quite how to say this, because somebody was given the job of designing a memorial for the Holocaust, and how could you say they did a great job? I mean, we're talking about the Holocaust here, right? It's so awful that it almost feels wrong to say that, but the truth of the matter is that what they did was a stunning achievement. And it has various things like a maze of lost communities and so on, but the central piece of it is a triangular installation that goes through the hill. But it's marked off with barbed wire, and inside the barbed wire are things like the shoes from Majdanek and so forth, and you have to go in this diagonal pattern through all these displays and exhibits. And then you come out over Jerusalem, the city of living Judaism. You cannot not be moved. And the Hall of the Lost Children, which is dark, and you walk up on ramps, and they've taken, I think, 5 candles and mirrors to produce 1.5 million lights. However, I did notice one thing about it that was very interesting. It's horizontal, not vertical. If it were a Christian thing, Christian sacred architecture is vertical, as opposed to horizontal. There's a bridge between earth and heaven. And maybe that's a trivial thing, but I think it helps to explain the medieval cathedrals. Why are they built that way? You know, part of it, you could just say, well, they finally figured out how to do this with stone. But I think part of it is there was an impulse to do something with stone that in other parts of the world, despite the extraordinary creativity and things like the Taj Mahal, which is breathtakingly beautiful, that impulse is not there in the same kind of way. Now, in the end, of course, the Middle Ages was done in by things like gunpowder and printing. But again, although these things kind of put an end to the Middle Ages, certainly to feudalism, they did so having come from within this civilization that is so creative, that is so dynamic, and of course the reason for creating movable type in the first place is to print Bibles. Gunpowder, I'm not so sure. Though, of course, as many of you aware, gunpowder was not invented in medieval Europe. Gunpowder was invented in China, where they used it to have good festivals. They just went to Europe, where they used it to conquer China, which, you know, again, does not necessarily reflect all that well on the Europeans, except on their cleverness, but there we are. This is a civilization that is dramatically different from that of Rome, and I think mostly in good ways. It's the disappearance mostly of slavery, and when there is slavery in Europe, a lot of it's Mediterranean and tied to other parts of the world that are not Christian. The appearance of some kind of political liberty. Eventually, during the Renaissance, in most places other than England, things like the Cortes do get extinguished and absolutism rises. In England, this never happens. It's a close-run thing. At one point, Henry VIII does get Parliament to pass a law saying anything he says is law, which is what they put Richard II to death for, by the way. He said, the law is in my mouth. And they said, we'll see about that. But when Parliament passed Henry's bill, they tacked on, except, of course, that you can't do anything that infringes our traditional rights or liberties. Thank you very much, have a nice day, and off he went. But it's not in the Middle Ages that political liberty disappears on this half-functioning scale in Germany and in France and in Spain. It's in the Renaissance. The modern world goes the other way. But what it does is it infringes on a kind of functioning political liberty in institutions that didn't exist in the ancient world. Hospitals, universities, economic dynamism, kinds of literature that don't exist elsewhere in the world, a creativity and a respect for the vulnerable that exists in the medieval world, and that in large measure, I'm with Chesterton here, we're living on the fumes at this point in the modern world. We are not a civilization different from the Middle Ages. We're just a civilization in which the medieval synthesis that has been breaking down for centuries is continuing to disintegrate, leaving, as he put it, both the virtues and the vices wandering about in mad isolation from one another. There's an interesting point that Richard Weaver makes in the Ethics of Rhetoric, talking about mathematics being the language in which truth is written. He said, if one has to select the term which in our day carries the greatest blessing and whose antonym carries the greatest rebuke, one will not go far wrong in naming progress. And then along with it is fact. He said, today's speaker says it is a fact with all the gravity and air of finality with which his less secular-minded ancestor would have said it is the truth. The word fact went into the ascendant when our system of verification changed during the Renaissance. And he adds, it is surely worth observing that nowhere in the King James Version of the Bible does the word fact appear. An interesting reflection. Somehow or other, we have drifted away from this world into this world of progress. Somebody summed it up recently. What do people think? This inevitability of progress. The inevitable triumph of objective critical intelligence over superstition, of sophistication over simplicity, of human beings over nature, and abundance over scarcity. And one more that somebody added, and that is gradually diminishing cruelty. And this is what we're promised in the Renaissance would happen. And we believed it. I mean, okay, I know nobody in this room was there and said, yeah, okay, I'll take that. But it did tend to pervade the culture, along with the notion that any established thing must be bad. It's sort of an evolutionary attitude towards moral and cultural as well as other habits. So it's been around for a while. It's done its job. Now it's gone. The first Episcopal bishop to ordain a lesbian said whenever faced with a difficult moral decision, he chose change, the way of the future. You know, here we are, right? As Thomas Sowell said, change could be anything from the Second Coming to the Third Reich. You need more specificity before you know if it's a good thing. As Chesterton said, progress is providence without God. But all of this leads me to the notion that the modern world, remember when I quoted Robin Cook at the beginning, that the concentration camps belong in the Middle Ages? Well, no, I mean, they don't. They belong in the 20th century. That's where they came from, and heaven only knows what we shall have in the 21st. This was Lord Dunsany who said, we cannot be content with mustard gas. This is the age of progress, and we must go on. On this sort of moving the goalposts and so on. We have not achieved this greater and greater agreement on fundamental truth that people like Mill and Jefferson thought was going to happen. We've got the internet, where you can go out there and find anything you like and not ever hear a contrary opinion because you can carefully select where you hang out. People can tweet pictures of their private parts, deny they said it, and then hope to retain political office. This is 500 years of progress for you, and you can have it if you want it. Some people still think, well, if we just get a little bit richer, it'll all fall into place. But there's a marvelous Alexander Herzen, was a Russian revolutionary who actually came to his senses, which unfortunately was too rare in that milieu. And after working for progress, at one point he said suddenly, if progress is the aim, then for whom are we working? Who is this Moloch who, as the toilers approach him, instead of rewarding them, draws back, and as consolation to the exhausted, doomed multitude crying, Morituri te saluant, can only reply, after your death it will be beautiful on earth? Do you really wish to condemn people to the sad role of caryatids, supporting the floor on which others will dance? Or of wretched laborers up to their knees in mud, dragging a barge filled with some mysterious treasure, and with a humble inscription, progress in the future, on its flag? And it goes on, each age, each generation, each life had and has its own fullness. And I tried at the beginning to shake off this sort of materialist notion that history is inevitable, and then to get rid of this negative image of the Middle Ages in order to be in a position finally to say you can see in medieval Europe, despite the lack of hot running water, a society transformed, very different from the Roman Empire, despite obvious elements of continuity, and transformed in a way that didn't happen in the rest of the world. It was, people sometimes say, Islam needs a reformation. And again, they're just adopting the historical model. First you have the ancient world, then you have the Dark Ages, then you have the Middle Ages, then you get the Reformation, and stuff starts to make sense. Of course, some people on a kind of narrow theological level have said, no, actually what Islam needs is a counter-Reformation, because Islam's never had a pope. That if there is a problem with that religion, analogous to a problem in Christianity, is that anybody can issue a fatwa. We need someone to say your fatwa is no fatwa, or something along those lines. But really the analogy just doesn't fit. The idea that every part of the world is going to go Antiquity, Dark Ages, Middle Ages, Renaissance is wrong. Europe went that way. The rest of the world didn't. Europe went along a path that other people didn't go along. And again, the materialist explanation of history, we could say, well, you see, Europe had heavy, wet soil. And it couldn't be farmed using ancient technology. But once you got the horse collar, because the collars used on oxen tend to strangle horses. You get the horse collar, the horses are smarter, they work harder. You get the wheel plow. You tend to get this decentralized political authority, and then blah, 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 blah. It's all natural. It's forces and social trends and Europe in the age of modernization and so on and so on. But if you shake that off for a moment, you notice that Europe is weird. I find myself trying to tell my students that they live in a weird world. I suspect you people being not in the Peace Man, but you're countercultural. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. The modern world is weird. But the modern world may be even weirder than you know. The things you like and the things you don't like about it are strange. They are not historically inevitable. I wouldn't even put them down from if we discard any faith for a moment and just treat history as one thing after another. They're not probable. Nothing about the modern world, going back through the defeat of the Germans in World War II, nothing about the modern world is really probable. The kind of social, cultural, and political configuration that exists in the West, imperfectly realized and subject to all sorts of lunacy and malice, is not like that of the rest of the world. Victor Davis Hanson, again, Carnage and Culture being a bit off topic, but it's a very interesting book. He says that ever since warfare between the West and the non-West began, the ratio of casualties on the battlefield has been around 10 to 1. There's something about the self-organization of the West that is different than the self-organization of non-Western societies. And I credit John Patrick with the insight that a greater value on truth or a greater value on loyalty tends to explain a great deal about what social patterns are like. If you don't, you said that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, it was you, yeah. You know, and of course, then you go back to the Bible, and Christ says the truth will make you free. He says, I am the way and the truth and the life, which is, again, not a statement you find in other holy books. There's something different going on here, and it produces a civilization that is different. And for all its failure sometimes to live up to its ideals, and again, you don't have to tell Christians why people fail to live up to their ideals. You go and ask Peter, why did you deny Christ? Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Those guys were scary, you know. This emphasis on the fact that every individual matters, that weakness deserves sympathy, not contempt, translates into attitudes toward slavery, toward women, toward children, toward the rights of ordinary citizens, toward the kinds of institutions that ought to exist that are different. And people may pride themselves on being cynics and think they're pursuing self-interest, but their self-interest, their understanding is conditioned by their ideas. What Chesterton talks about, the inverted triangle from father, mother, and child to child, mother, and father, there's a kind of inversion of the whole universe. He says with Christianity, nothing has changed except everything is upside down. That weakness has a sacred quality. And again, you could certainly find elements of this in Judaism. I'm not suggesting this came out of nowhere, and you can, God's plan or cultural influence, depending. I think more God's plan hands go up in this room. Nevertheless, there is something in Christianity that is not the same. Greek philosophy meets Judaism, and something comes out of it, for whatever reason, that is qualitatively different, and it has this huge cultural impact. A cultural impact so large that you get even a trivial story like this guy in Toronto who beat a raccoon savagely with a shovel, and had no idea that this would cause controversy. There's something right there in microcosm. A clash of civilizations. That I'm sure that he'll come around on that. This isn't one of those real big clashes of civilizations, but it's still a very interesting moment. Western Europe is odd. What happens from Rome through the Middle Ages to the modern world doesn't happen because that's the way history goes. We haven't seen this happen in 40 different parts of the world over a whole bunch of different centuries. It's not because of the alignment of the particles. Something happened that changed Western Europe, and it happened exactly as though it were because of the rise of Christianity. And with all due allowance for historical accident, I think that it would be illogical not to say this is why it happened. This is the single most important reason for it, is that the rise of Christianity itself, weirder than the weirdest thing ever, changed how people thought, how they saw themselves, how they saw the universe, how they thought about their fellows, how they understood society, political authority, the nature of charitable obligations, the meaning of communal life. Everything was different. And, as I said at the beginning, I think almost everything was better. People did not cease to be vile and violent hypocrites, and this is not to be expected until you know what. Nevertheless, given what they had to work with, it produced a society that I think really does exhibit qualities that were valuable, qualities that in many respects were missing in the ancient world, qualities that are often missing elsewhere in the world, and that we shall be very sorry to see disappear, as they in many ways do seem to be disappearing from an increasingly post-Christian world. So think of it first and foremost. I mean, I suppose as Christians you have to think of it first and foremost in context of salvation, but once you get past that business about afterlife and, the beatific vision and all those things, we historians and economists have more practical things in mind. Think of it as a culture transformed in ways that were by no means likely, that are by no means standard, and that are worth traveling around the world to see again for the first time, as though they were neither necessary nor probable, and that they are, in most respects, a blessing. This is how I regard the cultural impact of the triumph of Christianity. And I think it is as remarkable as it is desirable.